It should come as no surprise to you, at least I hope it doesn't come as a surprise to you, that the capital city of a nation represents its very heart. When you think of going to Japan, you'll probably think of visiting Tokyo. When you think of visiting England, you'll think of going to London. The reason for that is that the capital is often the cultural identity of a country. It is more than just the seat of government and the place from where law is generated. It is the very essence of a people. The strength of a country is often embodied by the prosperity of its capital. It therefore makes sense why New York was the first capital of the United States, why the wealthiest city in China is Beijing, and why 15% of all the wealth held in Great Britain sits in London. It is not only the economic strength the capital holds, it is also the very social fabric and livelihood of the state that is often established in the capital. So it is in Paris that the French Revolution begins. It is also only when the Soviets raise their flag over Berlin, Germans are forced to come to terms with the fact that the ideas that led them to start the bloodiest war the European continent has ever seen were wrong, despite the hundreds of towns and military bases that had been liberated prior to that moment. So you may therefore ask yourself, how are capital cities chosen anyway? Often location is key. Madrid is located at exactly the center of Spain, and when Nigeria decided to build its new capital city, it placed Abuja right at the center of the country. South Africa is a particularly unique case in the world, and that is the only country in the world that, at least at present, has not one, not two, but three capital cities. Pretoria is the administrative capital, the seat of the president and cabinet. Cape Town is the legislative capital, home to the country's legislative parliament, including the National Assembly and National Council of Provinces. And Bloemfontein is the judicial capital, home to the Supreme Court of Appeal and the second highest court in South Africa. What's fascinating about this, however, is not that the South African government has strategically spread its power across three governments. Instead, it is how that division came about and how these cities were selected. Cape Town sits at the southwestern end of the country. That is not the center. Furthermore, the cultural flavor that Cape Town has developed is so distinct from that of Pretoria and Bloemfontein that the answer to the question which city truly represents the cultural heart of the South African people might not even be Cape Town, despite the vital role it has played historically in establishing the country. This video is an exploration of why we have three capitals in South Africa, why they are where they are, and what keeps them together amongst all the diversity of people and geographical features. To understand why there are three cities, you must understand that the borders we now consider South Africa's didn't really exist until the early 20th century. In fact, until then, South Africa was probably best described as something like a hodgepodge of British, Zulu, Sotho, Xhosa territories and a number of what were known as Boer republics, independent self-governing republics formed by the Dutch-speaking inhabitants of the Cape Colony and their descendants who decided to move into the interior of South Africa. This move was caused by their dissatisfaction with aspects of British rule, especially the ban on holding slaves implemented after 1834, and the British reluctance to take any further land from the Xhosa for white settlement. Of the republics they went on to form, two gained independence and international recognition. The chief being the South African Republic, gaining its international recognition after the Sand River Convention in 1852, when the British withdrew from the Southern African interior and guaranteed them self-governance without intervention from British government. In 1855, Martinus Pretorius, who was one of the first presidents of the South African Republic, also known as the Transvaal, he founded a city on the banks of the Apies River. Designated as the capital of the Transvaal and arguably the center point of Boer culture, he named it Pretoria, after his father, who had played a significant role in the Boers' expansion into the interior. In the case of Bloemfontein, located in the now Free State province, it was originally founded by British Major Henry Douglas Warden in 1846. He bought the farm Bloemfontein from a Griqua farmer to establish the capital, which became the seat of the British-administered Orange River Sovereignty, which was a short-lived political entity, partially due to the fact that the British had insufficient force to maintain their authority in the area. And so in 1852, a royal proclamation was signed abandoning and renouncing all dominion in the Orange River Sovereignty. Called the Orange River Convention, it officially recognized the independence of the area, which was called the Orange Free State. And of course, there was no mention in the convention on where the boundaries between the Basotho and the Orange Free State would be. Nevertheless, the first two presidents were sworn into office of what would become the Orange Free State Republic, an independent and self-governing Boer state. The British renounced control not only over the Boers, but also over the Basotho and the Griqua. For 50 years, the Boers were able to rule themselves free from the grip of the British Empire. But in 1866, gold was discovered in the Transvaal. Which was a very big deal because at the time the whole world was still on the gold standard. The empire once again had its eyes on the interior of South Africa. So the Boers gave the British an ultimatum to cease building up their forces in the region. However, they still refused to grant political rights to non-Boer settlers, most of whom were British. And on top of that, they refused to grant civil rights to Africans. And in 1899, war broke out. It is considered by many to be the first modern war, and it ended in victory for the British. All the Boer republics were to become dominions within the British Empire. Much like Canada and Australia, it meant that there was a promise of future self-governance. The Union of South Africa was born in 1902 with the terms accepted by the Boers under the Peace of Vereniging. The terms were that a compensation fund of £3 million was to be established, coloured persons would receive the same legal rights as they had in the Cape Colony, and the republics would become crown colonies, though with the ultimate aim of self-government. However, on that matter of the votes for the Africans, the Boers were emphatic that the matter should not be discussed, and it would not be raised in the colonies until they became self-governing, which eventually happened in 1910. But as some historians have noted, once self-governing, no Boer state would consider giving the votes to Africans. So to avoid any further hostilities, when deciding where to place the government of the newly formed Union of South Africa, it was decided to compromise by spreading out political power between the Cape Colony, Orange Free State, and Transvaal, giving us 3 capital cities. In many ways, it is that each state got to have its own capital as representative. Still, today, the dominant language spoken in Cape Town is different from the one spoken in Bloemfontein, which is different from the one spoken in Pretoria. Cape Town signifies the beginning of the spread of white settlement in South Africa, whereas the establishment of Pretoria signifies its end. Pretoria's founding marked the end of the Great Trek, and that is pretty much how the South African capitals were chosen. As strategic as they were, it was also in large part a compromise. And that ethic of compromise is one that is emblematic of all South Africans, I think. To compromise in the name of a greater unity, a price you have to pay for diversity.